right. Good morning. My name's Rob McDonald. I'm one of the elders here, and I get a chance today to be part of this sermon series on Ruth. And we find ourselves in chapter 2 today. We've done 2 already that were in chapter 1, set up a lot of things. Both Tom and Jonathan have done a great job with their respective passages. And today we get to be part of the story where Ruth and Boaz meet. We're saying a lot of goodbyes today. But the passage is all about the hellos. So you might want to be, I couldn't help but think today, Amanda and I met at Bible College, Nipawin Bible College, and if anybody wants to see a vintage jacket from that era that we were there, Jason and Lindsay Alford are here today. They're the current presidents of Nipawin, and he brought one. He wore it. Do you still wear that, or is that just promotional material? Yeah, so that's circa 1995 or 6 or something like that. So that's pretty cool. So like a lot of people, we met in Bible college, and it was a love story right from the start. But so. I'm going to pray first, and then I want to get into this passage. So, Lord, thank you for this chance to be together today, to think about this passage, to think about these people, to give some consideration to how we might model and emulate some things, and just help us as we go through this scripture that that we could do it some justice here this morning. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So our story starts with the ending of chapter 1, where Ruth has committed to staying with Naomi. They come to Bethlehem, and they create a bit of a stir. Everyone's is this Naomi? Is this the one that left a little while ago? And so she's known in this community. If you've been away and come back somewhere after 10 years, there's a few people that recognize you and kind of remember, and they're like, I think that's Naomi. And Naomi says, that's not me anymore. You can call me Mara. And Jonathan did a really good job last week kind of going through this whole name and her suffering and what that kind of meant. But anyway, Mara, because the Lord has afflicted me with misfortune. That's kind of her state of mind here. Chapter 1 ends with Naomi in that state of grief, probably despair, save for one small hope. Ruth has decided to stay with her. And although her depression is probably in that, she's having a hard time focusing on that aspect of hope. But the chapter ends by saying they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, remember, Naomi and her husband had left the area previously due to there being a famine. They had gone to Moab, and they'd lived there a good 10 years probably, but the 3 men in their story all died somehow. And so when she heard that there was food again back home, she decides to come back. And she gets there right as they're doing the harvest. Now, the concept of moving from one place to another is not odd to this church or this town. We understand migration. We understand financial migration. We have this whole lantern ceremony to acknowledge and to celebrate that. But there's typically a feeling of being the outsider associated with moving. If you've ever had to start in a new school, you know this well. I'm a missionary kid. We are from a moving family. I started over in tons of schools. It's not pleasant. But as you kind of, it's just part of life. You get through it and whatever. But it's that feeling of being the outsider. Like you don't quite belong to this community. And so Ruth chapter 2 verse 1 says, Now, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Now, our passage starts off right away by introducing the concept of relatives having to care for those in their families who find themselves in trouble or danger. Verse 1 says, now there's a wealthy and influential man. He's a relative of Naomi's husband. And so far we've come along. They've migrated back. It's all about Ruth and Naomi. It's about to talk about Ruth and what she does next. And the author pauses and says, by the way, there's a relative. Right? And it's a nod towards this whole idea of relatives having some responsibility to care for those in their families. It's a cultural and a little bit of a legal thing, and we'll get into that a bit. But the next verse says, the next verse starts, Ruth is going to go out and she's going to get a job in the morning, but the chapter starts by throwing this out there. There is this guy, right? This whole idea of the kinsman redeemer, it's been explained a little bit already, but in Israelite society, there were provisions for people who found themselves in some trouble or some danger. A near male relative had the privilege or the responsibility to act for a relative who was in trouble or danger or even in need of vindication. There was the whole idea of paying off debts, taking in people if needed, these types of things. They had to be a near relative, they had to be willing, and they had to have the financial means of taking over that responsibility. But it also there's also this idea of the levirate marriage where the brother of a man who died would take on his wife, providing for her and keeping alive that family name. And this is a strange concept for me. I am living in 2025. This is the culture of an ancient society. But this is kind of how things went. They provided this provision for people when things happen like this. And in the story of Ruth, she basically proposes such an arrangement, such a marriage to Boaz. But the tension in the story is whether or not he accepts that responsibility to redeem his relative's dependence. It's not a cut and dry situation, though, as Boaz is not actually that close of a relative. And there are other aspects to the story. Boaz eventually having to be asked directly to be that kinsman redeemer. Thankfully, Chris gets to deal with that section of the passage next week. I don't have to. But he gets asked directly to do that. And then he agrees. Is there a love story there? I don't know. Maybe. It's a bit transactional at the same time. But there is a legal process he has to go through because that whole aspect of the levirate marriage applying to this situation wasn't that clear either. So there's a kind of a lot going on that I don't think we really know a lot about it. But at the end of the day, this story is not a lesson in how to manipulate a rich man to marry you. It's a story of fulfilling our responsibilities to each other, of caring for each other, of doing what it takes to survive, of integrating the outsider, of being people of character, of being kind to those you're not necessarily expected to, and God providing for all involved, and God using all of that as part of his story of redemption. So the harvest, they arrive at the beginning of the harvest. And for agrarian societies like this, they're governed by the rhythms of crop life. The beginning of harvest is significant. So arriving at that time is pretty relevant to this story. When the barley's ready, it's cut down with, I'm no farmer, this is literally research. When the barley's ready, it's cut down with hand sickles this is interesting, by the men, and then bundled into sheaves by the women. There's very clear roles in this whole endeavor. And then in this story, all these sheaves are brought to a threshing floor where the grain is loosened from the straw by crushing or beating it, and then winnowing, where it's literally tossed in the air with a fork and the wind blows the straw away. And when you read different stories and you hear scriptures, at various times you hear of separating the wheat from the chaff. Like Psalm 1 says, the wicked are like chaff the wind blows away. This is kind of what they're talking about. You toss this in the air, and the wind takes the stuff away you don't want, and you're left with the bits that you do. So that's the whole winnowing process. Now, in this whole endeavor, you have what's called gleaning. And this is where you can come along behind the harvesters and pick any barley stalks that were left behind, and then go and thresh it yourself and get the seeds and make whatever food you make with barley. Naomi and Ruth probably weren't making alcohol. I'm sure they were kind of focused on the food bits, I would venture. But the law was that a harvester had to leave behind what was not picked up initially for the widow, the foreigner, and the poor. This comes straight out of Leviticus. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Later in Deuteronomy, when this is summarizing the law for the people, when you're harvesting your field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat olives from the trees, don't go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, don't go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That's why I'm telling you to do this. Now, I want to park here for a moment. So, who are these groups that they are to leave the harvest for? Foreigner, fatherless, and the widow. All right. That the book of the law, most of us bypass through on our tours through the scriptures, that'd be Leviticus. It focuses on how people of God are to worship and how they are to engage in moral living in response to God's holiness. And a key part of living morally in response to God's holiness is how they treat those on the margins of society. And so Leviticus and Moses, i.e. Deuteronomy, lay the responsibility for the care of the marginalized in society squarely at the feet of everyone. How the poor are treated among you says a lot about your commitment to living morally in response to God's holiness. Now, in our modern societies, a lot of this formal responsibility is taken over by the state or the government, which enables us potentially to remain oblivious to the realities of a lot of people amongst us. Unless you get involved directly. Maybe you work at the food bank, or you're a nurse at the ER, or like some friends of ours in Okotoks, they sponsored an Afghan family to come to Canada. We can live in such a way that we're isolated or insulated from the realities of many in society. But what's great about this story is that it ignores all the big structural policy issues around some of these things and focuses instead on the actions, behaviors, and attitudes of the individuals involved, which is, ultimately where we all find ourselves. One of the groups, though, that's mentioned over and over again, as you noticed, is the foreigner, of which our heroine Ruth is mentioned quite a few times in the book, that she's a Moabite. And Moab was not a favorable place to be from. It mentions her all the time. This is Ruth the Moabite. It's like saying, this is so-and-so from Bonnieville. It's just kids soft. I just wanted to kind of stoke the rivalries there a little bit. But the whole, I'm not going to get into necessarily all the sort of the issues of, say, immigration that our country faces. Our neighbors to the south have been kind of really working through over the last while. But regardless of the policy decisions made by countries, what this story does is forces us to reconcile our individual actions and attitudes. Because as a Christian, I need to take lessons from this story as to how to treat the foreigner. Because in this story, the foreigner, who is also a woman, is a widow, and she gave up her mother and father, so vulnerable times 4, is treated with kindness. She is included legally into the society through her marriage and becomes a key figure in the line of not only David, but the Messiah. So it's God bringing into his story of redemption everybody, not just the privileged few. So back to our story. This is where Ruth finds herself in the field of Boaz. He notices her. He hears good things about her, welcomes her, and he goes so far as to ensure she is safe. Let's read it together. I don't have it on the screen, but you can find it wherever you have scriptures, or you can just listen. So this is Ruth chapter 2, 2 to 13. One day, Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go out in the fields to gather leftover grain behind anyone who will let me do it." And Naomi said, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. And while she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he greeted his harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Boaz said to his foreman, "Who's that girl over there?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest over there in a shelter." Boaz went over, and he said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go into any other fields. Stay right behind the women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting, and then follow them." She's given her an orientation to her new job. "I've warned the young men not to bother you. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell to his feet and thanked him warmly. "Why are you being so kind to me? I'm only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about the love and kindness you have shown your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother, your own land, to live here among complete strangers. Excuse me. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully." "I hope to continue to please you, sir," she said. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not as worthy as your workers." Now, kind of back up a little bit. Naomi knows that she has a relative in this area named Boaz. Naomi knows about the whole kinsman-redeemer provisions in their society. She probably also knows that getting Boaz to take them under his care is likely one of their only chances at survival. That's just how these societies worked. Without a male benefactor, she and Ruth would have no rights, no power, no options for earning a living, or their options for earning a living were minimal. All they have access to is this little bit here, where you get to pick up the bits that the harvesters don't actually grab. Naomi would also know that getting Boaz to take them under his wing would need some skillful maneuvering. But they would also need God's help in making this happen. However, she doesn't seem to know that it's Boaz's field that Ruth goes to. As the storyteller says, as it turns out, she finds herself in the field of Boaz. Now that's a bit of literary fun I think the author is having, as the scriptures doesn't often attribute circumstances to mere chance. In fact, this little phrase, I think, emphasizes the message of God's providence without saying that directly. When we read, "as it turns out," we know what is really happening. It's God making things happen. So Ruth goes to work in an effort to provide for the two of them. She's gleaning, following behind the women, collecting what she can. And Boaz comes to check on things and chats with their workers. And he notices her and he asks, and there's different translations, but pretty much it's more or less agreed throughout the translation that he says something to the effect of, "Who does she belong to?" Now, why does Boaz notice her? The Bible doesn't really say. For the romantics in the room, maybe she was just particularly beautiful that day after working all day in a dirty field in the hot sun. Maybe he's the kind of owner that prefers to know who all his crew members were, and he notices someone new and he wants to know who she was. But and this is my speculation, I think he notices a young woman gleaning by herself, not connected to anybody, and he recognizes that this is a potentially risky situation for her. It's potentially dangerous. And so he asks, who does she belong to? I think that indicates the lack of independence of power that women would have had in that society in this time. As this question betrays the idea that she must belong to someone, and if she doesn't, then she's vulnerable in all the ways you can imagine. Now, in my imagination, it's like when you're in a public place, say you're in a grocery store or a park or a parking lot, and a child is walking around seemingly untethered to a parent. What do you tend to do? You immediately start to look around. Now, I'm not referring to Ruth or any woman as a child, but in that context, it would be notable that a woman who is alone and working in a field alone, and for a guy like Boaz, he starts to look around for who's this person connected to, and why is there a woman working by herself in my field? So he asks the foreman about her. He learns that she's the foreigner who came back with Naomi, and Boaz is impressed by that. Essentially, oh, that's that girl. I've heard about her. The foreman also says that she asked permission to glean in the field, that she's been working hard all day, save for one little break. And after learning that she's the foreigner he's heard about, and she's not under the protection of anyone, and hearing that his foreman has respect for her and how she has been working, he goes to her and he tells her to stay and work in his field. He tells his men not to bother her. Some translations say don't touch her. Some say don't treat her roughly. And it bothers me that he had to tell the men not to do that. But there we are. And it brings, and essentially though, it brings her effectively under his responsibility and protection. And she asks, okay, how have I found favor with you? Why are you being so nice to me? And remember, as far as he has done, or so far all he has done is based only on what he's heard about her and then just observed. And his response is that he's heard what she did for her mother-in-law. He respects the fact that she left her own mother and father and homeland and came to live in a place where she knows no one. He offers her an incredible blessing as a result, where he says, may the Lord repay you for what you've done. May he richly reward you. He anchors that blessing in a description of God that is very pertinent to her situation, the Lord under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And that's a common image in the scriptures of God protecting his own like a bird or a hen protects her young under its wings. And I wonder if he had any inkling at that moment that the wings providing that refuge would be his. That the answer to his prayer ends up being himself. But that's as far into the story as we get. That's as far as we go today. We save the rest for how he invites her into his world more. Naomi starts to conceive of how this might go. She's the ultimate sort of mastermind in this story. And I want to take the rest of our time today to consider what we might learn from just this little snippet of the story. There's a variety of lessons we can take from this little passage. So I want you to take a minute and go, okay, what have I learned so far from this passage? What would be a lesson for me that I've seen already? This is just a narrative. The author hasn't instructed you as to how to interpret that. And so for you, as you read this and hear this little story, you take a moment. What's the story teaching me? What jumps out at you? I'm going to hand you a few. 6, actually. But to start, what is it that's jumping out at you? What does it mean? So I'll start with the first one. I got them all there, so you don't have to be in suspense at all. The first one is about integrity and loyalty and taking responsibility. Ruth doesn't commit to her mother-in-law because she has to. It's a voluntary thing. At the very beginning, that's all set up. She could have left, decided not to. And she doesn't sit around. She's a pretty industrious woman. She says, I'm going to go to the field. I'm going to pick whatever's left over grain so we can eat. And part of that commitment and sticking with Naomi is that she's going to have to do some work. And I think Naomi here is probably a bit depressive still and seems a little bit inactive. I'm not entirely sure why she doesn't go along. I don't know that. But that mood of hers lifts pretty quickly when she learns that Ruth has happened to win the favor of Boaz. There, she knows that that's potentially one of their kinsman redeemers. Boaz as well, for his part, he takes responsibility as well. Initially for providing protection for someone he didn't have to. And he just did it because, well, by the looks of it, he respected her. He later agrees to be the redeemer, but as we see, he needs a bit of prompting because it's not clear to what level he's obligated to. So, just on initial sort of thinking about lessons, there's some integrity here, there's some loyalty here, there's some taking responsibility for things that you don't necessarily have to, but you choose to. Second, dignity and humility in work. Ruth gets going. She works hard. She takes initiative. She assumes responsibility, and it gets noticed. She's humble in her approach as well. She's not demanding or acting entitled to her rights. She asks to glean the field. She doesn't presume, and this gets her off with the right foot with the foreman. And there's dignity in her work and what she sets about doing. Because I would argue that we're created to work. Work is not something that's foreign to the human existence. It's there even, I think, in creation, and it's part of who we are. We're not meant for leisure and inactivity. In fact, we atrophy in many, many ways when we sort of pursue that type of life. So there's dignity in work. 3 is kindness. Kindness is a big theme in the book of Ruth. But I was having a hard time with this theme because kindness doesn't seem to me on first glance as worthy of, say, an entire sermon. Being nice is good and all, but is that really what we're taking from this? I couldn't quite justify that. However, when you think about it, what's an opposite of kindness? Would be cruelty, or at the very least, apathy, not caring. And so someone in a position like Boaz, one of power, he could go either way, right? Undergirding kindness is respect. And I think he displays respect here for Ruth, for her actions, for her character, but also her basic humanity. He pushes against the tendency in societies to treat the foreigner, the immigrant, the illegal as lesser than, and of deserving of cruelty, or at the very least apathy towards the various abuses that are commonly committed towards them. And instead, he chooses the much more powerful position of kindness and offering what he can to help. His kindness is costly, and as such is not just mere niceness. Kindness is action. It is not platitudes. It is not virtue signaling. It's action towards another. I think God puts people in our paths to help and to encourage us. And we need to be aware of those people. We need to respond. We need to be grateful. We need to accept. But he also puts people in our paths that we can help and we can encourage. And we need the eyes to see those opportunities when they arise, when God brings them our way, and have a willingness to to act like Boaz does. It's not niceness. Kindness is action. The next one, number 4, I think being around people of character. Both Boaz and Ruth demonstrate character. Their actions demonstrate who they really are. Boaz takes the basic mandate for caring for the poor. You can't just kind of take all the scrapings off your field. You have to leave some. He takes that basic mandate for caring the poor a step further. He offers protection, a kindness that is an example to follow. He goes on to invite her into his circle, contrasted, I think, with the other circle of individuals whom he instructed not to do her harm. And it means for us to surround ourselves with people of character. I think it's an easy take from this story that we be careful who we allow into our story. Our peer groups are essential to either our growth or our downfalls. Who we hang out with and spend time with determines who you become. Boaz proves he's a man you'd like to hang out with and learn from. As you read this story, it's like, yeah, that's a guy I wouldn't mind being around, right? He's powerful. He doesn't abuse it. He stands up for those who can't do it themselves. He's respectful. He's the kind of guy that makes you better. He's not a jerk. He's not a bully. He's not lazy. He's the kind of person you need to find and spend time with in our lives. But it's not just him. He realizes Ruth right away is the kind of person he'd probably want to be around. He recognizes in her a depth of character, not only in her work ethic, but the fact that she voluntarily signed up for this role of staying connected to and providing for her mother-in-law. I think we need to surround ourselves with the right people. Who you become who you hang out with. You hang out with abusers, disrespectful people, lazy people, wicked people, complainers, and generally negative folks. It's hard not to become that. Find someone around you who challenges you to become better. And remember Psalm 1. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with scoffers. But they delight in doing everything the Lord wants. Day and night they think about his law. They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season without fail. Their leaves never wither. In all they do, they prosper. The next little lesson. Did I say I had 6? Looks like there's 7 there. The power and place of women. Ruth's story is unique in ancient literature in that it gives so much press to the women of the story, to their friendship, and ultimately their ability to get things done. It highlights the essential roles of the women even when in very oppressive or restrictive cultures. I would contend that Ruth and Naomi are the primary characters. Boaz is a third. We give attention to Boaz in the story, and we have lots to learn from him, but the Bible highlights plenty of men. So when we get the chance to learn from women in the Bible, I think we take the chance. We've mentioned her example of taking initiative and demonstrating dignity and humility in her work. But as this story plays out, who is actually making things happen in this story? It's Naomi who sees the path clearly, that what needs to happen, and she controls the timing. It's Ruth who ultimately proposes the kinsman-redeemer marriage sort of situation. It's the women at the end of the story that bring the blessing to Ruth and integrate her from being a foreigner to part of Israelite society and history. It's the women who name the baby that Ruth and Boaz have, which is interesting. Even though Boaz takes the lead in the legal case later on, regarding whether he's the appropriate kinsman-redeemer, whether he can take on that role. The elders, at the end of it, act as witnesses, and instead of evoking the great male characters of their history, they instead name women. They name Rachel. They name Leah. And they're mentioned as the builders of the house of Israel. And then may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Those of you who are familiar with your Genesis stories, this is a humdinger that's like 18 plus to learn about that story. But essentially what Tamar does is forces Judah to take his redeemer responsibilities seriously. And it's quite a story. But in here, she's the righteous one in that story. Ruth, she gets named. May your family be great like Perez, the one that Tamar had, right? She gets exalted here. It's quite interesting. Ruth, in its entirety, I think, offers a counter to the usual male-centric narratives that we tend to focus on. And I'm, for one, grateful for that. I really enjoy reading this story from that lens. The next one, God's providence. Taking care of them as they go through their seemingly mundane tasks, just the everyday stuff that they got to do. He guides things through seemingly coincidental circumstances. God appears to be interested in the details of their lives, even when going through difficult things. In this story, God is ultimately working through and working towards the goal of redemption, even though these characters at their level don't necessarily see that. And hence the next major part of this story, and this is what we end with, that the genealogy of David. The marriage of an Israelite to a Moabite and the genealogy of David are key to understanding the whole message of the book, I think. I've spent a lot of time on Ruth's foreigner immigrant status, as I believe the book does. And then the book goes on to defend the marriage of Ruth and Boaz and to highlight the genealogy. As part of the lineage of the Davidic king, the story takes on a messianic character, partially fulfilled in the Davidic monarchy and then widened out to bring blessing to the whole world through a future descendant. That's a quote there from Murray Gow. That as part of the lineage of the Davidic king, the story takes that messianic character. It starts to focus us forward. It's partially fulfilled in the Davidic monarchy, and then it's widened out. This blessing to the whole world is widening out to all the future descendants through, ultimately, Jesus. Now, God's provision of blessing and redemption comes through the line of David and then through to Jesus. The lesson is that God's provision and blessing is meant ultimately for all, for the Jew and the Gentile. That's what we had going on here. We had a Gentile and a Jew. We had for the poor and the rich, for the man and the woman, that this provision and blessing is ultimately meant for everyone. So let's pray together.